Today's traditional tale is one that you may have heard of. It's from my traditional tales book and it's called The Sleeping Beauty. A long time ago, in a land far away, there ruled the happiest king and queen who had ever lived. They were very especially happy because after years of hoping in vain, they had finally been blessed by the birth of a beautiful baby daughter. The king and queen were so happy that they decided to celebrate by throwing a huge banquet for their family and friends, and all the most important people in the kingdom. As they sat down to write the invitations, a worried look crossed the queen's face. "The Countess Griselda will be very angry if she doesn't get an invitation," she said to her husband. The king's face went very pale for a moment. Then he shook his head and said, "No, she must not be invited. Griselda is wicked and mean. I do not wish her to cast her eyes on our beautiful daughter." And with that, they continued writing the invitations. The day of the banquet arrived, and all the most important people took their places in the great hall. Before the celebrations began, a line formed to pay homage to the little Princess Angelina. And there they all are, having a look at the new baby princess. She lay sleeping in her cradle next to the king and queen's thrones. 12 people stood in line, and one by one they stepped forward to give their gift to the sleeping princess. First up stepped the good lady soprano, who touched the baby's throat with her forefinger and declared that the princess would have a voice like an angel. Next came the Archduke Ernest, and with a light touch on her forehead, he vowed that she would grow to be very wise. Next came the Duchess Rose, who stroked the baby's face and declared she would blossom into the most beautiful flower of the kingdom. And one by one the guests came forward and bestowed the gifts of patience, kindness, faith, grace, fortune, virtue, happiness and sweetness. With just one guest left to give her gift, there was a terrible noise outside the great hall, and the huge doors were thrown open in a rage. In stormed the Countess Griselda. The great hall fell silent as she slowly approached the sleeping baby. There's Griselda. The king and queen jumped to their feet to protect their little one, but Griselda swept them both aside. As they looked up in fear at Griselda, she turned to them and whispered in a hard, cruel voice, "I think you mislaid my invitation, but I have come to give my gift to the precious child anyway." As she bent over the child, she cackled, "To this child I bestow the gift of absolute health until the day she dies." As relief itself showed on the faces of the crowd, she roared with laughter and bellowed, "Which is why it's such a pity she will not live beyond her 16th birthday." The crowd was stunned as she continued, "A spindle shall be her end, a common peasant's spindle," and she touched the tip of the middle finger on the baby's right hand. She then clapped her hands together and a great roll of thunder was heard before a terrible wind swept through the open doors, blowing out all the candles. When the doors were shut and the candles relit, Griselda had disappeared, leaving only her terrible spell behind her. As the king and queen wept, they didn't see the final guest, who had yet to bestow her gift. The Marquis Maria bent over Angelina and whispered, "I cannot take away the evil of Griselda, but I can give you the greatest gift of all. I give you the gift of love. On that terrible day to come, you shall not die a death, but sleep, little one, sleep deep and peacefully as you sleep now, until love comes to rescue you." She placed her forefinger on the baby's heart and then was gone. The king and queen were in despair, and they demanded that every spindle in the kingdom was destroyed. But they couldn't sleep a single night without worrying, and a day didn't pass that they let the little princess out of their sight for a moment. Angelina grew, and with every passing year she became sweeter, and with every passing day she became more beautiful. The day before Angelina's 16th birthday arrived, and as the king looked at his daughter, he felt a pang of sorrow, for he knew that he couldn't stop her destiny. There's all her party food ready for her 16th birthday. Her birthday arrived, and for the first time ever the king and queen allowed her to roam freely about the castle. The king had ordered a huge celebration to be prepared in the great hall for later that day, and Angelina had tremendous fun watching the cooks prepare delicious pies, pastries and cakes in the kitchens. She watched the servants making garlands of flowers and roamed through all the corridors to watch the preparations. In a corridor off the great hall, she followed the trail of petals, winding first one way and then another, up and up into a turret in the castle that she'd never visited before. When she reached the top, a door swung open, and in the corner of the darkened room, a little old lady sat spinning some yarn. "Come closer, my child," she beckoned. Angelina moved closer. "Closer still," she urged. When Angelina was close enough, the old woman reached out to Angelina's right hand and pulled it to the spindle needle. The princess gave a gasp of pain as it pricked her middle finger, and then she fell asleep into the deepest, most peaceful of sleeps. And as she fell asleep, the whole castle fell asleep too. The cooks fell asleep at the roasting spit, the horses fell asleep in the stable, the king fell asleep on his throne. Everything in the castle came to a complete and utter standstill. The years passed by, and with every passing year the thorns that grew around the castle became thicker and thicker, and higher, and the legend of the Sleeping Beauty spread to distant lands. As time went on, many brave princes tried to cut down the thorns, but no one succeeded, and countless young men were lost forever in the Forest of Thorns. Many years had passed before one very brave prince awoke from a dream in which the angelic voice of a strange girl had called to him from a thorn bush. He asked his father the meaning of the dream, but the king shook his head and said it was best he didn't know. But the following night, the young prince once again dreamed of the special girl, and this time he saw the princess deep asleep and calling to be freed. The prince was enchanted. She was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen, and again he asked his father who she was. Again the king refused to say anything, but when the prince's dreams continued, the prince felt he would rather die than live without the princess. The king relented and told his son of a sleeping princess far away. The prince lost no time and set off on a voyage that lasted a year and a day. Along the way he heard tales of the princes who had tried before him and the fate that they had met. Some had been turned to stone, some had been turned to water, and others had simply vanished without trace, but none had succeeded. The prince finally reached his destination and stood outside the walls of the thorn forest. He knelt and said a prayer for all the lost souls who'd tried before him, and then he raised his sword to strike the thorns. In that instant, a vision of the princess rose to him, and he was so overcome with love that he dropped his sword and tried to touch the vision. As he reached out to touch the thorns, and as he touched the thorns, they turned into flowers in his hands. The further into the forest he went, the more forest bowed down before him, until all that separated him from the princess was a carpet of roses. The prince raced past the sleeping horses, cooks, and the king, and ran up the stairs to where the princess lay. He bent over her sleeping form and placed a single kiss upon her rosy lips. In that instant she opened her eyes. Love had set her free. The cooks yawned at their spit and woke up. The horses neighed their yawns and woke up. The king yawned on his throne and he woke up. Everyone in the castle woke up. And when the prince led the princess to her father, he cried with joy and granted him any wish that he could choose. The prince asked for the princess's hand in marriage, and they both lived happily ever after. That's a lovely story of Sleeping Beauty.